Balanga, Bataan, Philippines, 1400 hours, April 10th, 1942. Heat hammered the road until it rang like tin, and the dust took its time settling on shoulders already turned the colour of the island. Corporal Jack Malloy, 192nd Tank Battalion, felt his pulse climbing his throat, each beat a dry knock. A ditch ran beside the column, a ribbon of brown water alive with midges. He raised 2 fingers the way a man would in any chow line back home, the old gesture for water, and the Japanese guard answered with doctrine instead of mercy. The Arisaka came down hard. Oiled wood met bone with a sound like a mallet on a fence post, and the world flashed white. Jack tasted iron, not water. He thought, stupidly, about the weight of a full pail on the farm in Wisconsin and the way the handle bit the palm. Now the only weight was his tongue, thick as felt. Behind him, a sergeant from the 31st Infantry hissed at a stumbling Filipino private to keep eyes front. In the cane, a young woman, he would learn later her name was Lita, held a chipped bucket under her shawl, watching as if guilt itself were liquid. The guard's bayonet rode easy in its frog, Type 30, straight-backed and businesslike, a 400mm promise. The rifle, Type 99, 7.7, slid to port arms. The canteen at the guard's hip clinked nearly empty. Senjin Kun, the field service code, hung in the heat without being spoken. Never lived to know the shame of capture. To men drilled in that creed, a prisoner asking for water sounded like profanity. The column creaked forward. A corporal went to his knees near a carabao wallow, and 3 rifles snapped up in a motion so smooth it seemed rehearsed. Jack swallowed nothing. April on Luzon could run to 34 degrees by mid-afternoon, and the road knew how to keep a secret. The air smelled of dust and manure and the sour brightness of diarrhea. Boots scuffed, dog tags clicked. Someone sobbed, a small sound that could have belonged to any man. When the guard stepped back, satisfied with the lesson, Jack steadied himself on a stranger's elbow. Sunlight found a bubble in the ditch and burst it. He promised, silently, that if he lived, he would remember this moment like a coordinate, the time when thirst became a crime. The line lurched again. Far ahead, a truck backfired and the column rippled. In the cane, Lita edged away, the bucket still hidden, a witness already learning how to write without ink. Behind Jack, someone whispered, "Water," so softly it was more air than word. The day had hours left. Roads bent north toward San Fernando, rails waited like open mouths, and the maps in some headquarters already had a new word penciled in. O'Donnell. Jack fixed his gaze on the next bootprint and tried to imagine the taste of rain. Balanga's chapel leaned into its own shade as if churches could pray. Lita de la Cruz pressed her back to the cool adobe and opened a missal whose pages had learned the shape of her hands. The pencil stuttered where sweat spotted the paper. She listened to the road the way a nurse listens to breath, for rhythm, for danger, for the moment when sound changes into silence. She wrote what uniforms did not have time to write. Names snagged from collar discs and sleeve patches, places that sounded like postcards, Ohio, Kansas, Batangas, ages guessed by faces, not records. She would have added serial numbers if she could have found them in the rags and dust, but men wore hunger now, not tags. A priest drifted past in a heat-dulled cassock and murmured that guards were bayoneting men who knelt to drink. Lita nodded because she had seen it. Mercy here drew steel like a magnet. Outside, a column ground by. The air tasted of rust. Somewhere a canteen cap pinged against metal, and a voice said, "Not for you." She dipped a corner of her skirt into a jar hidden behind a broken saint and crossed herself before stepping out. The cloth, cool with stolen water, touched a prisoner's mouth. His eyes flared, then shuttered. Lita backed into the shade as Boots approached, her heart beat a drum at retreat. Word ran ahead of the march like a rumour of rain. San Fernando, boxcars, rails. The men would be packed in tight, she was told, doors shut and latched so even light could not get in. Heat would make its own weather. Fainting would become falling, would become trampling, and the guards would call it movement. She could not stop a railway. She could count. She could make the names weigh something. She slipped a folded scrap into a loaf bound for the road, addressed to any medic who could read her cramped hand. Names, units, conditions scrawled like a field dressing, triage for memory. She bartered a chipped cup for a palmful of quinine with a merchant who carried contraband under cassava. She wrote down the trade because trades, too, kept men alive. Toward evening the light went amber and the road quieted. A lorry coughed by towing flatbeds, and the word O'Donnell drifted from its tailgate like smoke. Lita closed the missile and felt how heavy a small book could be. Her pencil had worn down to a barked nub. She thought about water, for the wounded first, then herself last, and held the bucket until her forearms trembled. Somewhere out in the cane a nightjar called, and the road, relieved, fell briefly still. Sato Hiroyuki had learned to count differently since landing on Luzon. Time was the interval between rifle butt smacks. Distance was the space a bayonet could cross in a heartbeat. He was 21, a farm boy from Niigata who had memorized the field service code until the syllables turned to gristle in his mouth. Never lived to know the shame of capture, never accept humiliation. The code did not mention thirst, except to ignore it. His squad's Arisakas rode easy, bolts slicked with a thumb of oil. The bayonets, Type 30s, hung like metronomes, 400 millimeters of discipline knocking lightly against thigh. He had jabbed a man in the ribs that morning for leaving the ranks to crawl toward a ditch, not hard enough to penetrate, just enough to turn the body back into a soldier-shaped object that could be moved at speed. He told himself he was saving time for a timetable he did not set. Orders spoke of clearing Bataan quickly to pivot against Corregidor. Ammunition had to move, trucks had to pass, prisoners had to be somewhere else. The canteen at Sato's hip was light. There would have been a ration point later, he had been told, but later was a calculation voiced like faith. Roadside puddles bred fever. Discipline bred progress. He did not think about factories, but factories thought about him. Somewhere across the ocean, Americans stamped steel in numbers that would have sounded like lies in his barracks. He did not know that their armories had already turned out more than 5 million M1 Garand rifles, a river of walnut and Parkerized metal that could arm a nation and a cousin beside. He did not know that more than 8 million Type 30 bayonets had been made since 1897, enough blades to arm legions and to be present wherever a rule needed enforcing on a hot road. At noon he was told to enforce pace at a culvert where men paused without instruction. He slapped a helmet with the flat of his palm, barked the single word for move, and watched a line regain its sway. A Filipino private collapsed. Sato's boot nudged. The man rose, eyes cloudy, and Sato felt a small, shameful relief. No bayonet, no report, no delay. The road narrowed through a stand of bamboo and opened to a vista of low fields. Heat had bleached the horizon. Insects stitched the air. Sato looked at his canteen and decided to drink on the next count of 100. He reached 97 before the whistle blew. The column moved. He recapped the lid and told himself it was better this way. The arithmetic of thirst, like any arithmetic, demanded that someone be subtracted. Camp O'Donnell announced itself first by smell. Latrines overwhelmed, sweat turned sweet by fever, the faint copper of blood gone thin. A gate of wood and wire took men in like weather takes a field. Jack Malloy crossed and counted the boards under his boots, numbers as prayer. He learned the new economy fast. A canteen lid, if bartered, equaled a cup of rice water. A patch of shade equaled an hour. A scrap of soap equaled a night without as many flies. Everything cost something. Sometimes the price was measured in friends. The camp did not so much hold men as stack them in rows of heat. Pumps coughed more air than water. A medic in a sweat-stiff shirt showed Jack where to stand when the drum filled and how to tilt the lid so each sip felt like a victory. He had watched a man drop to his knees at a trough and press his mouth to a trickle, and he had watched a guard's bayonet flick down like punctuation. The road's rule survived the gate. Thirst asked nothing. Punishment answered. Lita's missile arrived hidden inside a loaf. A corpsman who understood contraband slipped it into a pocket and, when he could, added dates to the names she had written. Hours turned into sums. He would later describe death here as a weather pattern, rises, peaks, slow falls, because O'Donnell moved like a fevered climate. In the first weeks, roughly 1,500 Americans died, and with them tens of thousands of Filipinos, the totals climbing until rumour lost its appetite. Jack learned to make a mouthful last. He rinsed a cut with a gesture more theatre than medicine. He trained himself to breathe slow and shallow, as if he could trick the body into patience. The sun put its hand on his sternum until dark, and then night brought the coughs, the moans, the sudden absurd laughs that landed with their own cruelty. He wanted to drink until memory blurred. He wanted sometimes not to want. When the pump worked, the line moved in a choreography of hope. Lids presented, poured, withdrawn, the tin ringing like bells. When it didn't, men sat under the bare flagpole and watched nothing happen until their eyes watered enough to wet their lips. The map in his head still ran north to San Fernando and Capas, but the horizon now was a barrel and a ladle. Arrival, he understood, was only a different sort of march. Morning found him staring at a dented cup the way a navigator stares at a compass, praying it would point to rain. Fog lifted from Richmond shipyard number 2 like a curtain, and the cranes woke with a cough that sounded almost human. Rosalind Carter struck an arc and watched a seam bloom white-blue, the puddle of molten steel obeying the steady rhythm in her wrist. She could smell the ocean over the oil, taste grit on her teeth, feel the night shift marching out as the day shift marched in, a relief in place executed by citizens in denim. A foreman tapped his clipboard with a pencil eroded to brass and said, almost kindly, that if she kept pace she would beat yesterday by a foot per hour. She checked gauges because speed without safety wasted steel, and steel turned into hull numbers. On the bulletin board, a hand painted 2,710 so large it bullied the eye. Liberty ships planned, not rumour, not boast. The record from keel to launch had fallen again. Modular sections arrived like sentences, and welders stitched them into paragraphs a convoy could read. At lunch, the USO rolled a projector into the canteen. Film juddered onto a sheet, rows of aircraft flowing off American lines in curves that climbed like a flight path. Willow Run flashed, 1 bomber an hour at peak, the narrator said, and the room went quiet because the line sounded like fiction that happened to be true. A map shaded the Pacific with arrows that thickened into ropes. Someone behind Rosie whispered that Japan's yearly totals could not match what America now lofted month after month, an arithmetic that felt like prophecy. The load plan posted by the quartermaster's office read like a hymn: chlorination units, collapsible tanks, plasma bottles, quinine by the crate, field kitchens and coffee urns. It listed canteens by the 1,000 and mess kits by the tens of thousands, each line a promise that somewhere a man's thirst would be met by policy, not pity. She traced a finger down the columns and found comfort in the right angles. Logistics, she thought, was kindness with a shipping label. In the yard, the hull loomed like a grain elevator laid on its side. Riveters, some boys not yet old enough to vote, some women who once sold gloves on Kearney Street, traded jokes in 3 languages while their guns rattled like a drumline. A Navy inspector ran his palm along a seam and nodded the way a sergeant nods when a formation finally moves as one. Rosie lifted her hood again. The arc caught, a star in daylight. The ship would carry water plants and bandages and hope stamped into tin. If it sailed on time, it would meet a convoy counting minutes in a world where minutes saved translated to mouths spared. The whistle blew and she powered down, feeling the weld cool under black scale, and thought without irony that this was how a republic prays. Sato read the field service code to recruits in a dust yard where the wind could not be bothered to move. He held the pamphlet open with a thumb and spoke the syllables he had been given. Endure hardship, despise surrender, die rather than shame the colours. The words felt heavy in the mouth and light in the stomach, which growled anyway. A supply wagon arrived with rice that did not fill the sacks to their seams, and the sergeant waved it on as if discipline could stretch grain. Sato's canteen, dented from a fall, rattled dry. He promised the men a ration point after drill and saw their faces practice obedience. Across an ocean, other promises were being kept on time. Rosie's yard added a shift. A chalkboard listed tonnage in strokes so bold the numbers looked like architecture. The bulletin below it carried a statistic that would have read as an insult to reason in any other year. America would build roughly 350,000 aircraft before the war was done, while Japan would muster a fraction of that, around 76,000. The United States had decided that arithmetic was a weapon, and it fired it daily. On Saipan, ground crews rolled a shining B-29 from a revetment, its skin taut as a drum, its bomb bay able to cradle up to 20,000 pounds of explosives without losing the manners of a pressurized cabin. Spare parts were not counted by individual piece, but by crate. Spark plugs came in ranks, fuel pooled in tank farms mapped like small inland seas. A Navy notice passed between mess halls mentioned, almost casually, a floating ice cream plant turning out 10 gallons every 7 minutes because calories and morale had been added to the tables like any other supply. A Coca-Cola unit unpacked near a training range and ran bottles through washers and fillers until the clink sounded like rain on tin roofs. None of it felt wasteful to the men who lifted the cups. It felt like proof that the machine at home wanted them alive. Sato, who had never tasted such a drink, watched a corporal cut a can of sweetened milk into 6 parts and hand them down a line of recruits who pretended not to notice the tally. He turned the pamphlet to the page that warned against softness and found that his eyes kept returning to the can instead. News filtered through like wind through bamboo. American submarines were sinking freighters faster than they could be replaced. Airfields were multiplying on islands whose names Sato could not place on a map. In the barracks that night, he lay on his side, canteen against his ribs, and tried to hear the ocean above the snores. He pictured a ladder of arrows stepping toward him one island at a time, and he understood, though he could not have said the word, that a democracy had turned factories into doctrine. San Fernando's rail yard breathed heat like a kiln, and the siding glittered with mirage. Jack Malloy was shoved into a boxcar that folded strangers into neighbours. Wood closed, light thinned to slivers. The smell rose first, sweat made sweet by fever, manure baked from the boards, a sour that meant dysentery would do its work. Someone joked about practice for a submarine, and the joke died for lack of air. Breathing had to be scheduled. Men moved in relays, stand for 10 breaths, crouch for 5, trade places with an apology small as a nod. The roof popped in the sun. Flies found the knotholes and came anyway. A canteen tilted. Nothing came out. The man laughed once and stopped. The train clanked forward. Heat climbed until the air turned viscous. A man near Jack fainted and became heavy. The weight dragged others down, and they rose together because there was no other way. Someone hammered the wall with a mess kit until his palm split. The blows changed nothing. They marked time. At a knothole the size of a coin, Jack watched the world smear into cane and acacia, then the glint of a paddy like a shield. The car made its own weather, fogging as if exhaling. A guard outside slapped the boards with the flat of a bayonet, type 30, 400 millimeters of rule, and the sound travelled through bone. Water was a word that caused trouble. Lita, miles away, heard the locomotive before she saw it and counted cars by feeling jars on a pantry shelf tremble, 1, 2, 3, until numbers blurred. She could not see inside. She wrote anyway. Boxcars, unventilated, heat like ovens. Screams passing. It was a representative note, not a certified log, but the road had taught her to record what official paper would lose. She bartered for quinine with a shopkeeper who kept contraband under cassava and saved crusts for men who would never learn her name. At Kappas, the doors broke open like a hatch in a story about rescue that wasn't. The air outside tasted of iron and dry grass and a freedom that lasted 2 breaths. Men spilled into light and kissed dust as if it were water. Guards with arisakas used bayonets as prods, not knives, and tempo returned like a drumline. The column reformed and moved toward O'Donnell, as if called by a bell only prisoners could hear. Jack steadied a stranger and felt how quickly a human becomes cargo when the system decides time is more valuable than breath. Unventilated cars at midday can run past 100 degrees. Nobody needed a thermometer to prove it. Heat shimmered off the rails. A cloud built on the horizon and declined to help. When Jack looked back, he saw only a rectangle of shadow sliding over ties. He swallowed, found the taste of dust again, and measured the distance to the next drum of water in hope instead of miles. Richmond woke like a machine stretching. Rosie Carter lifted her hood and struck an arc. The seam answered in sparks that fell like brief meteors. Over the oil and hot steel she could smell the bay, and over the bay she could sense a route drawn by ships she would never sail. The foreman's clipboard ticked off modules arriving from shops up the coast, each section tagged and drilled, so the hull could come together as if it had practiced in secret. Speed mattered, but only if it lasted. She checked gauges because wasted steel was a kind of treason. A chalkboard at the yard gate tallied launches with fat numerals and a date beside each. Another Liberty down the ways, another convoy guaranteed. The number 2710 on the poster was not decoration, it was a promise. At lunch, a projectionist threaded film in the canteen. The reel hiccuped and then steadied into images of aircraft crowding runways like wheat shocks. A narrator's calm voice named factories as if reading a rosary: Willow Run, Fort Worth, Douglas Long Beach, and the curve of production climbed like a staircase. Rosie heard someone whisper that in a single month the United States now rolled out more aircraft than Japan could in many, and that the curve was still steepening. She chewed and listened as if the numbers had flavour. After shift, she walked through the quartermaster shed whose lists could have been poems: chlorination units, collapsible tanks, Lister bags, water purification powder by the drum, plasma bottles in shock crates, quinine sealed in tins, mess kits nested by the tens of thousands, canteens by the 100,000, coffee urns for field kitchens the size of a parlour stove. The manifests went on, lines marching like an infantry of mercies. It would have felt like excess if she hadn't seen telegrams from the front. It felt like duty. On the dry dock, a Navy inspector ran a hand along a seam and wrote a number. A chief boatswain swore softly, approving, and marked the welded run with soapstone. A rivet gun chattered to silence, and the quiet afterward felt like a chapel. Rosie thought of the men who would drink from those canteens, and of the ones who hadn't been allowed to, and she leaned into the torch until the puddle walked to the web and tied off clean. Somewhere in the Pacific, a submarine captain logged another freighter as a fire on the horizon. Somewhere on Saipan, a ground crew swore at a bulky magneto and reached into a crate of spark plugs like a baker grabbing rolls. Logistics did not shout, it accumulated. In the evening, as the new hull slid into water slick as oil, the yard fell briefly still to hear the slap and cheer. Rosie wiped her face with the back of a glove and thought of a tin cup ringing full, and of a man she would never meet hearing that sound at last. The chalk lines of the tennis court at Olongapo were almost gone, worn to ghosts by bare feet. December 1944 found the sun lower, but no kinder. Jack Malloy, hauled ashore after bombs cracked open a hellship, was herded behind wire onto the rectangles of concrete where games used to end with handshakes. For 2 days, there was nothing to eat and almost nothing to drink. Then came the ration that mocked itself. 5 spoonfuls of raw rice per man, a tap watched by a sentry with an arisaka resting casual across his shoulder. The concrete radiated heat long after sunset. Shade was a currency more scarce than quinine. A prisoner near Jack wetted a rag and passed it down the line, and men took it like communion, squeezing drops onto tongues and eyelids. A guard paced, and every once in a while the butt of the rifle found a back to remind the yard of rules. From the fence, Jack could see the bay, where ships he could not name came and went, distant as a rumour. The tap hissed. A man ahead of him reached early, and the sentry's boot corrected the arithmetic. It was the same lesson written again in a new hand. Water asked for was water denied. He swallowed against the ache and watched clouds stack over the hills. If they broke, he would have opened his mouth like a child. Instead, the sky held its water as if it too had been briefed. Across an ocean, while Jack counted spoonfuls, American factories were committing what would have sounded like fiction 2 years earlier. By 1944, the United States could turn out aircraft by the hundreds of thousands, more than 350,000 before the war was done, while Japan's total hovered around 76,000. The difference read like a misprint until you stood on a hot court and heard an engine far above drawing a contrail on the day. A bomber like the B-29, pressurized and deliberate, could lift upward of 20,000 pounds of bombs and repeat the act as if heavy flight were a habit. Spare parts moved in crates, fuel sat in tank farms measured like lakes. The impossible statistic hung over the Pacific like weather you could not outmarch. A rumour ran the wire that some wounded would be taken to a hospital. Instead, a truck arrived with orders and a small squad that made mercy into logistics again. Jack kept his eyes on the tap. When his turn finally came, the water tasted of metal and algae and survival. He took more than was polite and less than he wanted. The guard did not look at him. Somewhere behind the fence, a bucket knocked over, and the whole yard went silent as if for a serve. Evening came like a truce nobody signed. Jack lay down on warm concrete and counted breaths as if they were rations, and dreamed of rain that had the manners to arrive on time. The theatre smelled of popcorn and oilcloth seats, an unlikely place for a ledger to become a eulogy. Rosie Carter sat 3 rows back as the projector threw grainy light, and numbers climbed the screen like a relief column. Ships launched, planes accepted, convoys delivered. A chart drew the submarine war as a collapsing bar, enemy merchant tonnage shrinking month by month until the graph itself seemed to run out of ink. The narrator did not raise his voice. He let the arithmetic do that. A newsreel cut to a hospital ship nosing into a pier, white hull scarred, and the gangway filled with men whose faces broke at the sight of land, water towers, and mothers. Lita's missile lay on a table 2 blocks away, under glass for the first time since she had hidden it in a loaf. A corpsman ran his finger down her lists and matched names to affidavits. Dates softened into sequences. Captured, marched, railed, camped. Boxcars, unventilated, she had written, heat like ovens. And now a weatherman turned analyst offered daily highs for April 1942 on Luzon, as if the atmosphere itself could testify. The book did not accuse, it remembered. That was enough. A Navy logistics officer briefed a civic hall that smelled of sawdust and coffee. He read a manifest from a single convoy and let it stand without flourish. Chlorination units, collapsible tanks, water purification powder, plasma, quinine, sulfur, mess kits, canteens by the 100,000. He paused on that line and looked up. Enough to replace every canteen lost in a campaign, he said, not smiling, and then keep replacing them. The hall was quiet in the way churches are. In the back, a Marine with his arm in a sling cried without fussing over it. Rosie left the theatre and walked down to the pier where a Liberty she had helped weld sat lower in the water, home with salt on her plates. A clerk showed her a clipboard heavy with outbound numbers and inbound ones. Gallons purified and issued, meals served, litres of plasma transfused at sea. The scale felt impersonal until she imagined a tin cup ringing under a ladle, a vein finding relief under a needle. She looked at the builder's plate and ran a thumb along the weld she had made, now scuffed and reliable. Behind her the harbour made its small traffic. Tugs fussed, gulls complained, and a crane swung as if it too had somewhere to be. The clerk said the next convoy would sail on the morning tide. He said the word like a certainty you could taste. Rosie pictured the line of hulls, the ocean stretched taut between continents like a belt, and the cargo, stacked and strapped, moving toward men whose thirst would be met not by chance but by schedule. The numbers had become a promise kept. The courtroom fan turned like a slow propeller, stirring paper and sweat. Jack Malloy sat straight despite a uniform that fit like a borrowed coat. The microphone's cloth cover smelled of dust. He gave his name, unit, and dates the way a soldier gives a challenge and password. The prosecutor gestured gently and asked about the road near Balanga. Jack told him about the ditch, the 2 raised fingers, the rifle stock, and the taste of iron. He did not dramatise. He did not need to. The stenographer's keys clicked as if counting seconds. When asked about the boxcars, he spoke of breath scheduled in relays and of heat that made water into a rumour. He used the phrase unventilated cars, and the room flinched as if the word itself were an iron door. At Camp O'Donnell he said thirst was a rule, not an accident. The ladle sometimes found the bottom of the drum and rang it like a bell. A table to his right held exhibits arranged like a mechanic's tray. A Type 30 bayonet lay under glass, straight-backed, roughly 700 grams, a blade near 400 millimetres. A diagram of an Arisaka rifle's bolt sat beside it, clean and indifferent. There were mortality tables without rhetoric. There were route maps pinned with coloured string. Mariveles, San Fernando, Capas, O'Donnell. A meteorological chart for April 1942 rested on an easel, the lines patient and damning. A quartermaster from the Richmond yards testified to manifests, chlorination units, collapsible tanks, canteens and mess gear by the 10 and 100,000. He did not testify to ice cream or Coca-Cola bottlers. The court had enough to consider. Sato Hiroyuki did not appear. His name surfaced in a roster entered as evidence. The doctrine he had served appeared in translation, the field service code warning against shame and suffering capture. A historian explained how such words, taught as scripture, made mercy a punishable error and speed a sacrament. No one pretended the empire was incompetent. The court understood too well that competence in the wrong service hardens into cruelty. When they asked Jack for a final statement, he surprised himself by speaking softly. He said the crime was not just killing, it was outlawing thirst. He said men cried when beaten for asking for water, and he said they cried from pain and fury and the insult to common sense. He said a canteen could be a promise or a threat depending on who held it. The judge wrote for a long time after the words stopped. Outside, footsteps passed like small convoys in the hall. Jack stepped down and felt the floor steady under his boots, as if the building had decided he could be trusted. He walked out into daylight and kept walking until he found a fountain and pressed the bar, and the water came cold and continuous like a sentence without a period. On a training field years later, pallets of water purification units sat beside crates of IV bags as neatly as ammunition. A young sergeant briefed recruits with the confidence of someone who trusted his supply chain. Litres per soldier per day, reverse osmosis capacity, chlorine residuals measured by simple kits. The talk sounded technical until you realised it was mercy standardised. Nearby, a field kitchen whistled, coffee steamed. What once had been improvisation at the edge of disaster had been written into doctrine so deep it felt like weather. In a museum across town, a Liberty ship's builder's plate hung beside a dented canteen and a ledger under glass. Lita's missile looked too small to have carried so many names. A placard made the arithmetic plain without theatrics. 2,710 Liberty ships built. American aircraft production exceeding 350,000. Enemy totals around 76,000. Another card noted more than 5 million M1 Garands turned out by war's end. The numbers did their own oratory. Visitors mouthed them silently the way people do in cathedrals. A grandfather in a ball cap traced the seam on the plate and told a child that welders won wars as surely as any general. The child nodded gravely, as if accepting rank. A lecture in a small auditorium connected statistics to behaviour. A logistics officer explained how forward water points and hospital ships reduced fatalities more effectively than almost any tactical trick. He pointed to a photograph of a Navy ice cream barge and refused to apologise for it. "Excess is not excess," he said, "when it keeps a man in the line and reminds him what he's defending." The slide after that showed a B-29 being serviced, bomb bay yawning, crews swapping spark plugs by the box, fuel flowing from tank farms mapped like lakes. Technology became routine because factories made it so. Routine became advantage because democracies can afford to plan for comfort after capacity. In the quiet that followed, the speaker returned to first principles. The enemy code had forbidden surrender, and so it had taught soldiers to punish thirst as if compassion were treason. The American system had taught citizens to make, repair and resupply until cruelty ran out of trucks. The impossible statistic that once sounded like taunt now felt like liturgy. A free nation built more ships than an empire could defend, more aircraft than an island economy could fuel, more rifles than a creed could carry to a final field. The speaker lifted the dented canteen. It caught the light. He said the lesson was not just military, it was civic. You build so no one has to beg for water again. Outside, rain began like applause on the museum's roof. People stepped into it without hurry and tilted their faces up, and for a moment the world